Hello again. Okay, so this second podcast, which is the first which actually looks at the history of the causes of the war, is called The New Imperialism. Now, as stated earlier, really understanding why war broke out in August 1914, you've got to dig deep back. Most history books that look at the causes of World War I go back at least 40 years before 1914, going back really to the 1870s and the birth of Germany, when Germany was unified under Bismarck. A number of different topics that historians will focus on, and the first one is the notion of empire building. Imperialism, as of course we call it. Imperialism is the idea of building empire. Now, the map that you're looking at, you will have seen in previous lessons. It shows the various European powers who, the term we use is, there was a scramble for Africa, a race for colonies, or as Bülow referred to it, the Kaiser's Chancellor, a place in the sun. Germany was very late to enter that particular race for colonies, being a new nation. You can see the German colonies on the map there, marked in green. So why is this relevant? Well, because basically it did create tensions between the European nations, and that's one of the factors that goes into the melting pot as to why war eventually broke out 40 years later, because those tensions were simmering away for 40 years. Okay, so as you can see there, the text, in the 19th century there was a race by developing industrial European nations for colonies around the world. Many of these were in Africa, not exclusively. As you know, there were some in other parts of the world, in particular Eastern Asia. But Africa was the main focus of what we call hotspots, a series of events which cranked up the tensions, particularly, and I'll circle it here, in the north there, in Morocco. There were two crises in Morocco, one in 1905 to 6 and the second in 1911. We won't go into the details of these in these podcasts, but each of those really helped sort of like highlighted to Britain and to France that Germany was being provocative, and those two crises helped bring Britain and France together. Remember, at the time, if you'd said to people that there will be a world war, people would have assumed it was going to be Britain against France. They were the traditional enemies. Britain was a traditional friend of Germany's. Okay, so that's the map. Now moving, just a little bit of text here. The reasons for imperialism was economic. Colonies were a source of cheap raw materials for the industrializing European nations. So that was the first reason, but also a market for goods. So cheap raw materials go back to Europe. The factories in the various European countries produce the goods, and those goods can then be marketed around the world. And of course you can market the goods to the people living in the colonies. But it wasn't purely economic. There were lots of reasons why the countries wanted colonies, and political reasons were paramount as well. Nationalist prestige. Having colonies gave a European power status, and that's a real factor why Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted Germany to have colonies. Remember, even little tiny Belgium had a greater area of colonies than Germany. Belgium had the Congo region. So it was largely about nationalist prestige. There were other reasons they're not listed here, such as the fact, for example, men and women for the church, missionary reasons. They wanted to spread Christianity around the world. Social reasons. Many well-meaning people genuinely believed that having colonies was a way of spreading civilization, of improving the lives of people living in what we call quote third world countries nowadays, developing countries. Those are all reasons, but certainly from a historical point of view, the prime movers, the politicians, were motivated by nationalist prestige, working hand in hand with the businessmen, the industrialists, who were very much motivated by economic reasons. So a bit of background as to why empire building happened. But there's the key point, the third point. Rivalry did cause tensions. It did result in tensions, but there's so many historians will say if there hadn't been imperialism, there could very well not have been World War One. They were a significant contributor towards mounting tensions between the European countries. As I mentioned, for example, Morocco in 1905 to 6, and again in 1911, which definitely did crank up tensions between Germany on one side and France and Britain on the other side. However, it could be argued that these colonies acted as a safety valve preventing a conflict in Europe. So the notion here is that the European countries had invested too much in the colonies, and there was too much to lose. Colonies had been around for 40 years before the war broke out. In a sense, well, why didn't war break out earlier? So again, we'll develop that idea in a little bit more detail later when we do the podcast on the alliance system. That's this particular podcast. One extra point, which I didn't mention, perhaps I should have mentioned in the first podcast, is this whole slideshow. I mean, obviously, what you're looking at here is a series of slides broken into 7 podcasts, all joined together into one slideshow. You can obviously download it from Frog, and there is the note handout that goes with it, also downloadable from Frog. That's it. Close this podcast and open the next one, which will be podcast number 3.